Timothy, or Tim as his friends called him, glanced at his cell phone when a message from his wife Candace, or Candy as she preferred, popped up. He had just secured a major service contract with a well-established company in California, a deal that would expand his IT firm and likely increase his salary. Tim was eager to share the news with his boss, Jake Hudson, knowing how pleased Jake would be with the success. This contract marked a significant milestone for the company and potentially opened the door for more business. Tim was hopeful that with this new chapter, he and Candy could finally start the family they had been planning for years. But despite the excitement over his career, Tim couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Ever since he and Candy had gone on a camping trip with Jake just over a week ago, something about Candy seemed off. There was a subtle shift in her behavior. She was distant, preoccupied, and a bit irritable with him. What troubled him even more was something he had discovered when they got back home. As they were putting away their laundry, he noticed something strange in the gusset of one of Candy's underwear. Upon closer inspection, he realized it wasn't a stain that could be explained away. It was a foreign substance with a distinct odor. Tim's stomach sank as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He didn't know whose fluid it was, but it made him feel like the ground had slipped out from under him. With his heart racing and his mind spinning, Tim vowed to get to the bottom of things. He knew that an upcoming trip to the West Coast could be the perfect opportunity to confront the issue head-on. He decided to consult a lawyer to explore his options in case Candy was unfaithful. He knew the devastation that infidelity could cause, and he wondered if this was the end of their marriage. Ruby Hawkins, a lawyer specializing in family law and divorce, came recommended by a friend who had gone through a similar situation. "Are you certain your wife is being unfaithful?" Ruby asked, her tone direct but understanding. "Not entirely," Tim admitted, his voice tight with uncertainty. "But I need to know for sure. And if she is, I want a divorce." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "Well, in this state, most divorces are no fault. But if you want to file on the grounds of infidelity, you'll need solid evidence. Something like photos or video," she explained. Tim asked for clarification. "Exactly," Ruby affirmed. "If you want, I can have an investigator monitor her activities to confirm." "Please do," Tim replied without hesitation. "What can I expect in terms of divorce proceedings? We don't have children or real estate, but she earns about the same as I do from her teaching job. Will I have to pay alimony?" Ruby explained the typical course of action. If she's cheating, that could be used as leverage for a favorable outcome. You'll probably avoid alimony since her income is comparable to yours. The assets, without children or property, will likely be split evenly. Your retirement stays yours, and so does hers. Ruby paused before continuing. "I'll start compiling the necessary paperwork, and we'll proceed once we have evidence." Tim agreed, still shaken by what he had found. "All right, go ahead. I'll be away for about 3 days, which I suspect is when she might act." Ruby enlisted Marvin Johnson, a private investigator, to help track Candy's movements. Marvin suggested Tim install a tracking app on Candy's phone and provided him with a device to record landline calls, as well as a small audio recorder to hide in her purse. Tim was uncomfortable with the idea of spying on his wife, but he was desperate for answers. He felt like he had no choice. There had been other troubling signs. Since the camping trip, Jake had acted more arrogant and dismissive than usual, as if he knew something Tim didn't. When Tim was about to leave for his business trip, Candy drove him to the airport and kissed him goodbye, promising to call that night. She seemed distant, though, offering little in the way of affection. She then mentioned that she would be working as a waitress at a party Jake was hosting that evening. According to Candy, one of the original staff members had fallen ill, and Jake had asked her to step in. Tim hadn't been told about this by Jake, but Candy explained that Jake had promised her $150 for the night. It seemed like an odd request, but Tim didn't question her, though a sinking feeling was starting to settle in his gut. Tim didn't know how to feel as he hung up the phone. His wife, Candy, had just told him that she would be working as a waitress at Jake Hudson's party, a request that didn't sit well with him. Tim understood that Candy could use the extra money, especially since her classes were about to resume, but something about the entire situation made him uneasy. It didn't sit right that Jake, a man Tim had trusted for years, was suddenly asking her to work this job. Candy assured him with a soft, "I love you," and bid him good night, but Tim's mind was already racing with suspicions. That night, the knot of worry in Tim's stomach only tightened. The next morning, feeling restless, he called Candy's cell, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried the house phone, but again, it was met with only the answering machine. He shook his head, hoping that he was simply overthinking things, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no way she was spending the night with Jake, he reasoned. But his hopes came crashing down when he received an email from Marvin, the investigator he had hired. Candy spent the night at Jake's house, and she's still there, the email read. She was quite busy the night before. I've attached a few photos. They're pretty graphic, but I'll give you the full report when you return. Tim's heart dropped as he opened the attachments. The images he saw confirmed his worst fears. His wife, the woman he had been married to for 5 years, was caught in compromising situations. In one photo, she was with Jake. In others, she was with men Tim didn't recognize, men he assumed were friends of Jake's or colleagues from the firm. The worst part? Candy's eyes were filled with tears, and Tim's hands trembled as he held his phone, unable to believe what he was seeing. After several attempts to reach Candy, which went unanswered, Tim sat at the hotel bar, trying to process what he had just learned. The next morning, he checked the tracker app on Candy's phone, confirming that it remained at Jake's house. Marvin sent more photos, including one disturbing image that showed Candy, Jake, and his son Mike, along with 2 other men Tim had never met. He felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on him harder than ever. When Tim's business trip finally came to an end, he packed up and flew back home, contract in hand. Upon arriving, he noticed that Candy's car was gone, and the tracker confirmed that her phone was still at Jake's house. He went inside, changed clothes, and called Ruby's office. To his surprise, Ruby was available and could see him that afternoon. Just as he was about to head out to see her, Tim called Candy, only to be startled when she answered the phone out of breath. "Where are you?" he asked, already knowing something was off. Candy claimed to be at home, catching up on things. Shocked by her blatant lie, Tim told her that he was finished with his business in California and was on his way home. Candy responded with excitement, suggesting she pick him up at the airport, but Tim refused. "Don't bother," he said coldly. "I'll take a taxi." As he ended the call, Tim couldn't help but wonder if she noticed the absence of affection in his tone. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger, but he pushed those emotions aside as he left the house to meet Ruby. Meanwhile, Candy stared at her phone, noting Tim's lack of his usual "I love you" and the coldness in his voice. She had intended to leave after the first night, but the allure of being with Jake and his son Mike was simply too powerful to resist. She justified it as something she owed to her own desires, thinking it would all be over once her classes resumed. She didn't think Tim would ever find out, but the days dragged on, and Candy continued seeing Jake and Mike, staying with them as they arranged encounters with friends. It wasn't long before Jake suggested they find a way to make Tim's absence permanent. "I have classes soon," Candy said. "I can't risk it with Tim at home." Jake, always the mastermind, laughed off her concerns. "Why not let Tim see you with other men for a change? Maybe he'll finally understand." Candy's heart twisted with guilt, but she nodded. She knew she had to let it play out. "I love Tim," she whispered, "but I can't seem to stop myself from wanting this." Jake didn't say a word as he reached for his camera, the implications of what was about to unfold weighing heavily in the air. Tim struggled to find the right words as Candy leaned in for a kiss, her usual affection clashing with his cold distance. He turned his head, and the kiss landed awkwardly on his cheek. She pulled back, surprised by his lack of enthusiasm. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "Not really," Tim admitted, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not feeling well. Maybe it's just jet lag. I think I'll sleep on the futon tonight." "Sleeping out?" she asked, her tone laced with confusion. "Where are you going?" "I'm just not feeling up to it," Tim replied, his words lacking the usual warmth. "I'll be fine. I just need some space." Candy's face registered a brief flash of concern, but it quickly faded as she shifted into her usual mode of indifference. "Okay," she said, nodding as if she were already moving on to something else. She had no idea how deeply the betrayal had cut, or how much Tim was unraveling beneath the surface. His mind raced as he watched her, trying to push away the images of the videos and photos that Marvin had sent him. His heart ached as he thought about their life together and what they had become. Candy glanced at the clock and then back at Tim. "Well, I have some things to do," she said, not waiting for his response before she grabbed her purse and headed toward the door. "I'll be back later." Tim nodded absently, watching her leave, feeling the weight of the deception pressing down on him. As soon as she was gone, he sat down at the kitchen table and picked up his resignation letter. He had already emailed it to John Carlson at Empire. He couldn't work with Jake anymore, couldn't be a part of that world that had betrayed him so thoroughly. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. Jake, once a trusted friend, had used him in ways he couldn't even fathom. The betrayal had become too much to ignore, and now Tim was left with nothing but the painful reality of it all. As he waited for the evening, when he would finally talk to John about his new role at Empire, his mind couldn't help but wander to the idea of his own future, his new life. He needed out of this toxic relationship, but the steps to escape were more complicated than he ever imagined. Later, when Candy returned home, she seemed indifferent to his mood, which only intensified Tim's feelings of isolation. She dropped her things at the door, as though nothing was wrong, and went about her evening, seemingly unaffected by the tension that now permeated the house. Tim had made his decision, but he had no idea what would come next. "I don't mean to pry, but what brought you to us at Empire?" Rose asked, her voice warm but inquisitive. Tim hesitated, his thoughts momentarily racing, but he gave a polite smile and replied, "Well, after a few things went sideways with my previous job, I thought it was time for a change. I've been working with Jake Hudson for a while, and while the work was good, the situation just became too much to handle." Rose nodded, understanding the unspoken tension in his voice. "I see. Well, I'm glad you're here. It's not easy making those kinds of decisions, but sometimes they're necessary, right?" Tim couldn't help but feel a bit of relief. For the first time in a while, he was talking to someone who seemed to understand that there were more layers to his story than what was on the surface. He took a sip of wine, letting the warmth of the alcohol settle him. "Jake's a tough character to work for," John added, cutting through the tension in the air. "But we're happy to have you with us, Tim. You'll find things a lot more balanced here." Tim smiled faintly, grateful for their hospitality, but in the back of his mind, his thoughts kept drifting back to Candy and the mess he was trying to navigate. His mind was divided. Part of him was still angry, confused, and uncertain about everything he had just uncovered, but another part of him appreciated the normalcy, the momentary escape from his chaotic reality. The dinner conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Tim couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. He was no longer the man who simply went along with life. His world turned upside down by betrayal. He had to make decisions, to fight back, but for now, he was stuck in a quiet moment, pretending things were normal, even as everything around him was slowly crumbling. As the night wore on, Tim found himself a bit more at ease with the company. He laughed at a few jokes, complimented Rose on her lasagna, and listened as they discussed work, life, and everything in between. But despite the warmth of the dinner table, there was a gnawing sensation inside him. The reality of the situation was clear. He couldn't escape the web of lies and manipulation that Candy had tangled herself and him in. Tim sat quietly in his car, staring at the steering wheel. His mind was racing as he reviewed the conversation he'd just had with Jake. It was a surreal moment. His longtime boss, someone he'd once considered a friend, had revealed his true nature. And now, as he prepared to leave, Tim couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He had just handed over the signed contract, something he had worked tirelessly for, yet it no longer felt like a victory. In the end, his personal life had shattered, and he was done pretending it didn't matter. He hadn't expected Jake to react with the cold indifference he had shown. The same man who had, for years, laughed at Tim's stories, shared drinks with him after work, now stood there with nothing but disdain. "You think you're leaving just like that, huh?" Jake had said. Tim couldn't help but feel disgust rise in his throat. How had he ever trusted Jake? He was so caught up in his own world that he couldn't even see how much damage he'd caused. "You're not just walking away from a job, Tim," Jake continued. But Tim had already tuned him out. He wasn't interested in hearing Jake's excuses or attempts to manipulate the situation. Everything he'd built, everything he had put into the firm, now felt worthless. The only thing that mattered now was reclaiming his own life. Tim had promised himself he wouldn't let the bitterness consume him, but walking away from Jake and the mess he'd found himself in felt like a form of victory. As Tim closed the door behind him and left Jake's office, it became clear to him that this was the turning point. He wasn't going to play along anymore. No more pretending that everything was fine when it was falling apart. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't looking back. The drive home was long and quiet, and as Tim pulled into his driveway, he felt the usual pang of dread in his stomach. He knew Candy was still inside, but this time, the thought of facing her didn't feel as daunting. It felt like just another chapter in a book he was done reading. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he considered the inevitable confrontation. He entered the house and found Candy on the couch, casually watching TV, as if nothing had changed. Her smile faltered when she saw him. "How was your meeting?" she asked, trying to mask the tension in her voice. "It went well," Tim replied, his voice flat, almost mechanical. The usual warmth he had for her was gone, replaced by a cold indifference he hadn't realized he was capable of. "Good," she responded, not quite meeting his eyes. There was something about her demeanor that unsettled him. She was trying so hard to keep things normal, but Tim could see through it. The smile, the tone, everything about her now felt like a mask. He had known her for 5 years, but it was clear now that the woman he had married was no longer the person sitting in front of him. She had turned into someone else, someone he didn't recognize. Tim stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. It didn't matter. She wasn't going to listen anyway. She wasn't going to change. With a quick nod, he turned and walked toward the bedroom, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Candy called after him, her voice cracking slightly. "Tim, where are you going?" "Just to rest," he answered, without turning back. "I'm not feeling well." "You're not coming to bed?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "No," he said coldly, "I'm not." As Tim walked past her, he noticed the small, unspoken plea in her eyes, but he ignored it. There was no going back. He wasn't going to pretend like he could fix something that was already broken beyond repair. Walking away from her had never seemed so simple, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, Tim knew he was doing what was best for him. It wasn't about her. It was about him. That night, Tim packed his bags, his resignation letter in hand, and made a decision. He was done with the lies, the deception, and the emotional turmoil. He wasn't going to waste another minute in this marriage. Tomorrow, he'd take the next step and begin the process of moving on for good. Tim sat back in his chair, watching as the weight of the situation pressed down on both of them. His thoughts, once clouded with confusion and anger, were now steady and resolute. He was done with the charade, the betrayal, the lies, and the deceptions that had woven their way into his marriage. He couldn't bear to carry it anymore. "I've secured a position with another company," Tim continued, his voice steady, though the words seemed to hang in the air like a final declaration. "I'll be leaving here shortly. Then I'll head to HR." "Wait, Tim," Jake interjected, his voice tinged with desperation. "Can't we talk about this? Surely we can work something out." Tim shook his head. "There's nothing to discuss," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm done. Finished. I once considered you a friend, Jake, but you betrayed me, ruined my marriage, and for what? A fling with my wife? Find someone else to deceive." Jake's face twisted into a mix of frustration and defiance. "So this is about that," he muttered, his voice dripping with a false sense of superiority. "Your wife was just exploring her desires, Tim. Let her have her fun. She'll come back to you when she's done. It's all part of the process." Tim's hands clenched into fists. "You're despicable," he shot back, his voice thick with contempt. "You think I'm going to accept that?" He paused, his breath shaky as he fought to keep control. "How long have you been involved with her, Jake?" Jake's expression shifted slightly, a flash of discomfort passing over him. "The first time was during the camping trip," Jake confessed with a shrug, clearly unfazed by his own admission. On the second day, while you and others were out skiing, she came to me. She said I was superior to you. Then she begged me to have sex with her. Remember when you sent me away on that business call? You wanted me out of the way, so you could be with my wife. Tim's stomach churned at the revelation, and the reality of the situation began to set in like a bitter pill. Yeah, Tim said slowly, processing everything. So hiring her as a waitress at your party was just another ploy to sleep with her, right? Jake didn't even flinch. Correct, he said, almost matter-of-factly, as though it were no big deal. Tim paused for a long moment, then hit the record button on the audio device he had secretly set up when Jake arrived. Thank you for your confession, Tim said, his voice cold as ice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm done packing. I'll head to HR and be on my way. Wait, Jake protested, trying to stop him, panic creeping into his voice. You can't use that recording. Tim looked him squarely in the eye, an icy resolve flooding his veins. We'll see, he said, walking out the door without another word. I'm leaving. Goodbye, Jake. Rot in hell. Candy, on the other hand, was just beginning to grasp the magnitude of the situation. When Jake called her after Tim left, his words were uncomfortably matter-of-fact. He resigned, Jake explained with a strange satisfaction, and handed me a signed contract and a resignation letter. He knows, Candy. Candy's heart pounded in her chest as she frantically thought about what could be done. What did you tell him? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake, ever the manipulator, replied with startling honesty. I told him about the first incident during the camping trip, and then I told him everything. I even left the photo of you he had on his desk. Candy could feel the tears welling in her eyes as Jake's callousness hit her like a punch to the gut. You fool, she muttered under her breath, as everything seemed to unravel around her. What now? She asked, dreading the outcome. Jake's voice was dismissive as he shrugged. Not my concern. You handle it, or I'll be forced to step in. Just remember, I have videos that could cause quite a scandal. You want me to come over and handle things, or will you? No, Candy replied, her voice barely a whisper. You've done enough. I'll handle it. Jake ended the call without another word, leaving Candy feeling small, trapped, and hopeless. A few minutes later, Tim walked into the apartment, his mind reeling with everything that had just transpired. He spotted Candy on the couch, but said nothing as he passed by her. He was done with the games. His betrayal was too deep, and the damage was too great. After locking himself in his office, Tim made a call to his lawyer, the gravity of the situation settling in. Hello, Tim. His lawyer's voice came over the phone. I've received your latest email. I'm filing your paperwork now. Good, Tim replied. When can they be served? We can have them delivered late this afternoon, she offered. Will that work? It will. Thanks, Tim replied, hanging up the phone. His gaze shifted to the safe where he kept his personal items, and he retrieved his .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. He laid it on the table in the kitchen. It wasn't meant to threaten Candy. It was just a precaution in case her lover decided to show up. Is that necessary? She asked from the doorway, her voice shaky. I hope not, Tim responded coldly, but it's a precaution. Candy froze, her eyes narrowing. What is this about, Tim? She asked. We need to talk, Tim said, his tone unwavering. First of all, you'll be served divorce papers later today. Candy gasped, her eyes widening. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Tim stood tall, his posture resolute. You've betrayed me, Candy. This marriage is over. Tim stared at Candy as she cried, her body trembling in disbelief. It had come to this, the end of everything they had built together. He had never imagined a day like this, but there it was, the fallout from her choices. He had given her everything, and in return, she had given him betrayal. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he turned away, feeling the weight of the years that had been wasted. I don't want a divorce, Tim. I love you, Candy pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. Tim scoffed. Love me? You've been with Jake, his son, and who knows how many others. You've made your bed, Candy. I know about it all. That's why I filed for divorce. Infidelity is the reason we're here today. Candy shook her head. You have no proof, she protested weakly. Tim smirked as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He opened it, revealing time-stamped photos of her with multiple men, including Jake. The evidence was undeniable. "I've got photos," he said, "and I have video and audio too. So don't act like I'm making this up." Candy's face went pale as the realization settled in. Her eyes darted from the pictures to Tim's unwavering gaze. She knew it was futile to argue now. He had everything he needed. Tim's voice turned cold. "Given everything that's happened, I've been more than fair, Candy. You're getting half of the bank funds, your belongings, and that's it. No support from me. Your credit card is canceled, and I've already prepared a check for your share. I'm also filing for a restraining order that will keep you 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. You'll have until you're served to pack up and get out." Candy's voice wavered with shock. "You're kicking me out?" Tim nodded. "That's right. Pack your things. You've got no place here anymore." Tears began to stream down her face, her sobs echoing in the silent room. "What if I contest it?" she asked, her voice weak and desperate. Tim chuckled darkly. "Not wise. Think about the consequences if these photos get out. Think about your job, Candy. You wouldn't dare risk that, would you?" Candy hesitated, her resolve beginning to crack. "No," she admitted, her voice hollow. "I can't risk it. I need my job." Tim nodded. "Exactly." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Two more things, Candy. You'll return your rings, and you'll drop my last name. I'm done with you. You've become someone I don't even recognize." Candy's body trembled as she stared at him, her breath shallow with sobs. "You're heartless," she accused him. Tim's eyes were unrelenting as he stared back at her. "You gave me cause, Candy," he responded. "I just want to know one thing. What changed? From the loving, faithful wife I thought I knew to this?" Candy glanced down, shame and guilt flooding her. "It happened the second day of the camping trip," she confessed quietly. "You were out on the boat, and I was in the tent. Jake came by and saw me there, undressed. He seemed embarrassed at first, but we started talking, and then he exposed himself, and that was it." Tim's anger flared, his jaw tightening as he shook his head. "So some guy with a bigger dick than mine drops his pants, and that's all it took for you to betray me, Candy?" He paused, his gaze sharp. "How many times did you sleep with him during that trip?" Candy hesitated before admitting, "Twice. The first time when you were out water skiing, and the second time when Jake sent me back to the office." Tim's face twisted in disgust as he held up the photos of her with other men. "I see that none of these guys used protection," he said coldly. "Weren't you worried about getting pregnant or catching something?" Candy, still on the defensive, answered, "I'm still on the pill." "That doesn't eliminate the risk, Candy," Tim shot back. "You could still get pregnant or catch a disease. Was that what you were hoping for?" "Oh God, no," Candy cried, shaking her head. But Tim wasn't buying it. "You know, in all the time we've been together, I've been hit on by a lot of women who are much better looking than you," Tim confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I turned them all down because I believed I had a loving and faithful wife at home. But you? You didn't even consider the consequences. You didn't care about me. All you wanted was pleasure. I hope it was worth it, because I can't look at you anymore." He took a deep breath, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Pack your things. I expect you gone once you're served. And don't even think about trying to come back. Anything left behind will be disposed of." Candy's tears flowed freely as she stood up, still pleading. "Tim, please. Can't we try counseling? I'll never do it again, I promise." Tim shook his head. "I'll never forgive you for this. Not after what you've done. From the moment Jake dropped his pants, you willingly betrayed me. And I can never forgive that level of betrayal. Don't you love me enough to work through this?" Candy asked, her voice barely a whisper, her face pleading. Tim's gaze hardened. "No, right now I can't even look at you. The sooner you're out of my life, the better." Candy nodded, broken and defeated, before slowly retreating to the bedroom to start packing. Tim stayed where he was, watching her, his heart heavy with finality. She came back out after a while with bags of her belongings. "Can you at least help me take these to the car?" she asked, her voice weak and tired. "No," Tim replied firmly. You're on your own. And remember, anything left behind will be discarded or donated. She carried the bags out to the car and came back in for more. I can't fit anything else, she admitted. Can I come back for the rest later? No, Tim said coldly. You won't be allowed back. Ask your parents to collect your stuff, or I can hold off on disposal for a few days. Thank you, she whispered, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Tim's gaze remained unwavering as the officers approached, the weight of the situation heavy in the air. He had done everything by the book. The restraining order, the threats, the photos, it was all part of the plan. He'd made it clear to Jake, to Candy, to everyone involved, that there were consequences for their actions. No more games. No more pretending. The officers, now standing in front of him, exchanged glances before one nodded and turned back toward Jake and the others. You heard him, the officer said firmly. You're under arrest for violating a restraining order and making threats. You've got the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. The tension in the room seemed to crackle as Jake's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Mike and the other men, still frozen in place, looked at each other nervously. The realization hit them hard. They were about to face consequences for their actions. Tim's hand remained steady as he watched them, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him despite the chaos that had unfolded. Are you serious, Tim? Jake sneered, but there was no fire in his voice anymore, just a hollow sense of defeat. You're making a huge mistake. Tim didn't flinch. I don't think so, Jake. You're the one who made all the mistakes. The police officers moved forward, handcuffing the men as they murmured under their breath. The realization of what had just transpired began to sink in, and for the first time, Tim felt like he was in control of his own life again. The oppressive cloud of betrayal, anger, and deceit was finally starting to lift. As the officers escorted Jake, Mike, and the others out of the apartment, Tim allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had endured so much for the past few weeks, and though the journey was far from over, he felt a small glimmer of relief. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the one taking action, standing tall. The officers exchanged pleasantries with Tim before heading out, leaving him alone in the apartment. The door clicked shut, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Tim stood still, feeling the weight of the last few days and weeks finally start to dissipate. It wasn't easy. It hadn't been easy from the moment he realized what Candy had done, but he had made it through. He walked to the kitchen, his eyes landing on the pistol still resting on the counter. A tool for protection, for peace of mind, but also a reminder of what he was capable of if pushed too far. He didn't want to use it, but he wasn't about to let anyone push him again. Not Jake, not Candy, not anyone. Later that night, as Tim sat in his living room, the chaos of the day finally behind him, his mind raced with thoughts of what was next. There were still legal proceedings to follow, still unanswered questions about his future and what his life would look like after everything had settled. But one thing was certain. He was done being a pawn in their game. As the minutes ticked by, he found himself looking at the empty space in his apartment, realizing just how much things had changed. The home he had once shared with Candy was no longer a place of warmth and love. It had become a battleground. But that was over now. He could finally start rebuilding. The next chapter of his life was waiting. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was his to write. And as Tim turned off the lights and prepared to head to bed, he took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that no matter what came next, he had taken back control of his life. Tim took a deep breath, the weight of the situation still heavy in his chest. He had been through so much already: betrayal, anger, and finally, the slow process of healing. The last thing he expected was for Candy's mother to reach out after everything had settled. But as the conversation unfolded, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sadness and indifference. Is she all right? Tim asked, his voice softer now, despite the anger that had once consumed him. She's struggling, Bernice replied, her voice tinged with concern. She's in denial about her condition, and well, Tim, I'm sure you understand. She's made some terrible choices, and now she's facing the consequences. Tim couldn't help but feel a flicker of guilt, though he quickly pushed it aside. His sympathy for Candy had long since evaporated, replaced by a cold sense of justice. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. "I'm sorry to hear that," Tim replied, "but I'm not responsible for her anymore. You know that." "I know," Bernice said with a sigh. I thought you should know. She's been asking about you, but I don't know what to tell her. You've moved on, and I understand that, but I just thought you should hear it from me." Tim leaned back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had led him here. The days of deceit, the betrayal by the woman he had loved for so long, and the shocking revelation of what had really been happening behind his back. It had been a long and painful road, but he had made it through. Now, it seemed like the end of one chapter, but another one was waiting to begin. "I'm not angry anymore, Bernice," Tim said after a moment of silence. "I'm just done. It's over. I've moved on. And as much as you want me to be the person who saves Candy from herself, that's not who I am anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Bernice spoke again. "I understand, Tim," she said quietly. "I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry for everything." "Thank you," Tim replied. "But we've all made our choices. We have to live with them." With that, the conversation ended, and Tim hung up the phone. He sat for a moment, reflecting on the past few months. The lawsuit, the divorce, the personal growth. It had been a journey, one that had taught him a lot about strength, resilience, and the importance of standing up for himself. In the months that followed, life started to feel normal again. Tim's career at Empire was thriving, and he had finally found a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He still attended counseling with Rose, focusing on his emotional well-being, and he had even made some new friends at the gym and through work. But more than anything, Tim had rediscovered a sense of self-worth that had been chipped away for far too long. As time went on, the wounds of the past healed, but the lessons remained. He had learned that betrayal didn't have to define him, that he could move forward and find happiness even after the darkest of times. And though Candy and Jake had once been central figures in his life, they had become nothing more than distant memories. A few months later, after the final decree of divorce was granted, Tim was ready for the next chapter. He had no desire to rush into another relationship, but he had learned to embrace the possibility. The pain of the past had taught him the importance of taking things slow, of not repeating the mistakes he had made before. As he looked forward to the future, Tim felt a sense of relief. His life was his own again, and the mistakes of the past were no longer holding him back. The future was wide open, and he was ready to take it on. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to face them. Tim sat quietly in the living room, watching Candy as she wiped her eyes, still reeling from the gravity of their conversation. There was something about her vulnerability in that moment, an authenticity he hadn't seen in years. She had taken full responsibility for her actions, acknowledging the irreparable damage they had caused, and for the first time, he could see the remorse in her eyes. He stood, his movements deliberate and calm. He had made peace with the situation, knowing that forgiveness was not for her, but for himself. Holding on to anger and resentment would only weigh him down. He had learned that much through his counseling sessions with Rose. Tim had spent months trying to rebuild his life, and holding a grudge against Candy would only prevent him from truly moving forward. "Take care of yourself, Candy," he said softly, his voice steady but firm. He needed to leave now, needed to keep going with the life he had started to rebuild. As he turned to leave, he saw Candy nodding, her face wet with tears. "Thank you for everything, Tim," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Tim paused at the door for a moment, glancing back at her. He knew this was the final goodbye. There was nothing left to salvage from their marriage, and it was time for both of them to move on. "Goodbye, Candy," he said one last time, and with that, he stepped out of the door, leaving behind the woman who had once been his everything. Walking out into the crisp night air, Tim felt an overwhelming sense of finality. His past was behind him, and as he drove away from the house, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had made his peace with the betrayal, and he knew now that he had to focus on the life ahead of him, on building a future that was his own. He had already secured a new job, something that he was excited about, and he had even started making plans for his own future. a future where he could build a healthy relationship without the baggage of his past haunting him. Tim's heart was healing, and though there were still scars, he knew that they would fade with time. As he arrived at his new home, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had taken. It had been a rough road, but it had brought him to a place of strength and clarity. He was no longer the man who had trusted blindly, who had believed that love meant sacrifice at the expense of his own happiness. Now, he understood that love had to start with himself, and only then could he be ready to truly love someone else. Tim stood by the window of his new apartment, looking out at the city lights in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had faced the worst, and now he was ready to embrace whatever came next, with hope in his heart and a renewed sense of purpose. Be true, it was just a passing thought, a remnant of the life he used to know, but it lingered. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe he was finally ready to move on. After all, life had a strange way of unfolding, and perhaps he was due for a new chapter. With a shake of his head, Tim pushed aside the unsettling thought, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. As he drove to the bar, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift with every mile. He had made it through the hardest parts, and now, he was ready to embrace something new. His heart no longer ached with the bitterness that once consumed him. The pain of betrayal, the anger at Candy, had dulled over time, leaving only the lessons he'd learned and the growth he'd experienced. It had been a long journey, but he had come out stronger, more aware of who he was and what he deserved. When he arrived at the hitching post, Cynthia was already there, sitting at a corner booth with a couple of friends. She waved him over, her smile genuine and warm. As he approached, she stood up and greeted him with a friendly hug, the kind that felt comforting rather than forced. "Glad you could make it," Cynthia said as they sat down. "We were starting to think you weren't going to show." Tim laughed, feeling a genuine connection in her presence. "I almost didn't," he admitted, "but I could use a change of scenery." They spent the evening talking, laughing, and sharing stories. It felt natural, effortless. Tim was reminded of the simplicity of good company, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't weighed down by the past. He was living in the moment, enjoying the people around him, and savoring the feeling of lightness that came with it. As the night wore on, Tim found himself opening up more than he expected. He talked about the divorce, about the hurt and betrayal, but also about the lessons he had learned and how he was determined not to let it define him. Cynthia listened, offering her support without judgment, and for the first time in months, Tim felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start to trust again. When the night came to a close, Cynthia offered to give him a ride home, and Tim accepted. As they drove through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The pain was still there, buried beneath layers of time and healing, but it no longer controlled him. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances. He was moving forward, one step at a time. As they arrived at his apartment, Cynthia turned to him and smiled. "You're a good guy, Tim," she said softly, "and I think you're going to be just fine." Tim smiled back, a feeling of peace settling over him. "Thanks, Cynthia," he said. "I think you're right." With that, he stepped out of the car, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. As he walked up the stairs to his apartment, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe there was a future for him after all. And maybe, just maybe, it would be better than anything he had imagined. What do you think is the true cost of infidelity in a marriage, and how should someone cope with such a betrayal? Do you believe Tim's decision to forgive Candy was justified, or should he have cut ties completely? How much blame does Jake carry in this situation? And was Tim's legal action the right response? What do you think the ultimate consequences of Candy's actions say about justice and betrayal?